Hey, Stephanie, and Stephanie again. Thank you all for joining us today. If you weren't here Tuesday, great. If you were here again, thank you for coming back. Feel free to lob any hatred you'd like or hate mail towards GoToMeeting. We hear they love that sort of thing. So we were going to go ahead and get started. I do want to mention the survey that Stephanie asked you to fill out at the end. We have an assessment conference coming up here in June. The topics of which will be all over the place in assessment, lots of different wonderful things, great speakers coming in. If you're interested in it, go to assessmentconference.com and registration is still open. But I'll be doing a presentation similar to this at that conference, and so I would really, really love the feedback as far as things that I can improve or things that went really well from today's presentation to help in that. So please do be sure to fill that out. With that, let's get into some item analysis and some question statistics and what your data is telling you from your exams. We're going to go through a few different things today. I'm going to take you through the basic stats. I promise to make this as minimal a math lesson as possible and really more focus on what do these stats tell us, how can we use them, and then walk through some examples of how we can apply them to questions, how we can apply them to the assessments that you're giving at your institution. And then at the very end, we'll go into some general guidelines on how to use them, or at least a starting point with how to interpret some of the stats as far as what's a good number, what's a bad number. I take that as an opportunity, though, to say I'm actually personally very much against any hard and fast rules when it comes to item analysis, psychometric data. I believe that depending on the situation, depending on the other factors at play, whether it be the item writing itself, things in the curriculum, how something was taught, cheating by the students, there's a numerous number of things in play that can affect the statistics of an item. And so I don't believe that there's any hard and fast rule that is truly accurate to say anything with this point whatever or above is good and anything below that is bad. I think that those are born out of trying to give people a good starting place or a good general idea of what to look for, but so frequently I end up seeing them applied in sort of a black and white fashion, and I don't really think that's the best method. So there's a lot of ways to do psychometrics. There's a lot of ways to interpret them. What I'm going to give you today is the raw, exactly what the stats are and what they mean, without any sort of spin to it. And then I'm going to take a step back and say, here's how I like to apply them. Here's the methodology I think is really good and a best practice for using them to interpret things in your exams. I think if you were to throw a rope around 100 psychometricians, you're going to get 94 different opinions on how this stuff should work. I think ultimately, though, there's a lot of similarities between most of what is out there, and it just matters really what the situation is. So with that, one of the things that I used to get asked all the time when I was with the College of Medicine at Ohio State from my different faculty members was, how do I know if this is a good or bad question? Or, I think this is a great question. Can the stats even say that it's wrong? Because you're telling me these stats are terrible, but I think it's a great question. Or how do I reconcile what I know about my assessment, and maybe I've been giving this item for 5 or 10 years and the stats this year look crazy to me? There's a lot of different questions that come about every time you do an assessment. Is it valid? Were the items good or bad? And I use those terms loosely, as far as good or bad or, difficult or not difficult as we get into some of the different things. A lot of the times people can get caught up in semantics when it comes to psychometrics. And so ultimately, the way I look at it is that you have to start somewhere. And I think the numbers are the best place to start, but I think you will never truly use them well, and that you won't be doing the best you possibly can for your students in refining your assessments if you just look at numbers. I think you can't divorce the knowledge that you as faculty members have about how something was taught, why something was taught, how frequently, at what stage in the curriculum, at what stage in their mental understanding of the topics and competencies you're teaching them are they as students when they're approaching this item. Did you change the delivery method? Did you intend for this to be something that everybody should really understand and get? Or did you intend for it to be a really discriminating question that separates your best students who are really getting it from the ones who have a basic understanding? I think if you try to interpret statistics without that information, and without that perspective of the faculty member, then you're doing it wrong. And so I like to bring those things together. I'm not a big fan of people who didn't write the questions or do the teaching or in charge at least of the block of that curriculum or of that unit in the curriculum not being involved in the process. You can use numbers to make these decisions, void of all that, but I don't think that's the best practice at all. I myself was not a faculty member at College of Medicine. My expertise was assessment, and so it was a collaborative effort where I worked with the faculty member in charge of that exam to go through and make these decisions so that I could help bring that statistical understanding, and they could help me bring the contextual, basis by which why this was tested, how this was tested, and so on. So with that, let's start with some of the stats themselves. There's basically 5 main ones that we're going to focus on today. I'll throw a little bit about a 6th in right at the end of the presentation. It's more of an exam level statistic. But where we start is with item difficulty. We're very simply in that statistic, we're looking at the percentage of the class that got this correct. Did 20% get it right, 80% get it right, somewhere in between, or something above that. And you'll see it, depending on the report you're looking at or what software you use to generate your item analysis, difficulty. It's a pretty simple correlation. The more students got it right, theoretically, the less difficult it is. The more people, the lower the difficulty, the more people get it wrong, therefore the more difficult it is. Now, I've had lots of arguments with faculty members who say that an item that 100% of the class got right was actually extremely difficult. It was just taught very, very well, and that can definitely be the case as well. So again, I like to stay away from anything hard and fast as far as implement the rules about these sort of things. The next layer of the stats is starting to break up that group of students into subgroups to begin to understand a little bit deeper what's going on inside of the item. So beyond just what percentage of the overall group of students who took the exam, what they got on the item, you then lead to the upper 27% and the lower 27%. Those are quite simply subgroups of the whole. So you can say 30% of my top 27% of performers got this correct, or 90% of my top 27% of performers got this correct, versus whatever percentage, 10% of my bottom 27% of performers. I get asked sometimes why 27%. It's been a standard that's been around for a long time. Occasionally you'll see 25% used. I would say probably 95% of the time you'll see 27% used. You're basically just looking to create subgroups to begin to compare against each other to try and get a deeper understanding and include enough students in each of those groups that the numbers are meaningful, but not so many that you're basically counting the whole class again. So that's kind of where that comes from. Now, once you start to have, you've got that measured, how many of your top 27% and bottom 27% got that incorrect, that leads us to the discrimination index. So the discrimination index is basically telling you, did this item discriminate between your top performers on this exam and your bottom performers on this exam? And it does that by taking the percent of your upper 27% that got it correct minus the percent of your bottom 27% that got it correct. And it gives you a decimal representation, anywhere from 0 to 1 in the case that 100% of the top and 0% of the bottom actually got it correct. And so that's also represented in decimal form on pretty much any item analysis report you'll ever see. And so you get that discrimination index and you'll see, 0.2 or 0.3, meaning that there's, 20 to 30% difference in the percentage of the top 27% and the bottom 27%. Lots of percents and lots of groupings involving percents being thrown around. So really you're just measuring top students versus bottom students and looking for the difference. What's the difference between those? And if there's a good difference, you're going to see a positive number. If there's a bad difference being more of the bottom students got it correct than the top, you'll actually see a negative number. From there, the last one that I really want to focus on for the duration of today's presentation is point by serial. It's similar to discrimination index in that it is another discriminating statistic that did this item discriminate well between your students, but it does it a little bit differently. It actually incorporates all of your students. And so instead of just being the different groupings of them, it incorporates all of those students, and it puts it in a little bit further context of the whole of their score on the exam. It gives you a little bit more of an indicator of, was this item an accurate and kind of reliable indicator of knowledge of the whole or not? Meaning that if, you can have students do well on an item or answer the question, but this statistic can tell you that knowing that piece of information actually meant nothing about knowing really the whole of the content that you were assessing within that exam. Or the statistic can help tell you, yes, knowing this did correlate very well with the rest of the exam, and so it's a good indicator of overall knowledge on whatever you're assessing. The computation for that was a little bit more complex, and I don't really think it's necessary to get into the full math and details of that equation, so to speak. It's really more to look at what are the range of numbers you're going to see there, and how do you apply them to the individual questions. This is an example of an item analysis report. This is one of our types of item analysis report. We have several. I would say in most cases, you're going to see these numbers. How they're arranged exactly is going to vary a little bit depending on who you're using. But if you're using us, this is what one of the reports looks like, and we've got several. As you start to walk through this, you'll see several things laid out. You've got your difficulty right there, kind of the first thing next to your item number, what percentage of the class got this correct, and let you kind of flow through the next step. Of that 96%, 100% of the top students got it correct, 89% of the lower students got it correct, resulting in a discrimination index of 0.1. It did have a point by serial of 0.26, and then you roll into how many students chose each individual answer choice. So what's the count? What is the correct answer is indicated by the asterisk there. And then if you look below, we actually get into some more deeper substats that I would say you only use sometimes. We actually give you a point by serial and a discrimination index by individual answer choice, in addition to the ones that we give you for the item on the whole. And then that upper and lower 27%, it's great to know that 100% of your top students and 89% of your bottom students got an item correct. But where were the rest of them? So if, let's say that upper was only 50%, it's nice to know, well, if they didn't get it right, where did the other 50% of that top population go? What answer choice was distracting them? And that's what you can see down here. As you walk through, you can take a look and see, you know, okay, 100% got it here. Of the lower students, 90% chose the right answer, 5% over here, 3% here, 2% there. Nothing really, you know, magical about this item. It's just kind of a standard mastery level item. We'll get into some more detailed examples and kind of work through those here in just a second, but this is how the report's laid out. And really, as you start, you're looking for red flags. And every time you see one, it's going to sort of direct you a little bit differently through the item. Start by looking at the difficulty. This is where I think marrying that perspective and that knowledge that you have as a faculty member becomes so vital. This is 96% of the class is getting this item correct. Is that what you intended? Was this a mastery level item? You expect everybody to know it. It's important enough that you want to put it on the test, even though you expect every single person should know this. You want to put it on the test to ensure that they're getting it correct. Okay. Or, hey, you know what? Actually, I thought this was going to be a really difficult question. This is a question that, you know, should have had a lot of discrimination going on, things like that. That's where your first red flag can come in, right there at that difficulty. Now, in this case, if you did intend mastery, I'm probably moving on at this point. If you didn't, now you've got to sit back and think about things and look at it and say, okay, is my exam out there somewhere? Did students memorize items and post them for other students on the internet or something like that? Or, you know, is something more nefarious going on? Or maybe, hey, we changed how we taught this year and we really hammered it home, and I guess it's not quite so difficult since we spent 3 times more classroom time on it this year. Whatever those different factors may be, you can't look at the stats and just rely on them to tell you the whole story. I think you've really got to start there. So the first step is always going to be that percent correct, kind of married with the perspective of what were you expecting? Now, nobody expects faculty members to be clairvoyant. You're never going to perfectly predict exactly the performance on every item just by your intention of it, but it gives you a basis to kind of start getting your feel for, are these stats good? Are these stats bad? Are these stats what I expected? Or are these stats something we need to dig further into? So we're going to go into some examples. Again, the context is what matters. And the key to these examples that I'm about to walk through is the context is very different on each one. And I think it really reinforces the point that the exact same statistic on question 1 versus question 2 can mean completely and totally different things. And a point by serial of 0.25 can be phenomenal and great, and an item you should keep in your exam and not throw out or not rescore. It's exactly what you were going for on question 1. And a point by serial of 0.25 on question 2 could mean you need to throw the item out, or could mean that you need to accept multiple answers. It really, really does matter the context. So let's walk through some contextual situations. This is another one, and I won't spend much time here because it's very similar to the previous report we just saw. This is a mastery level item. 98% of the class got it correct. You're not going to get a discrimination in much of a point by serial when that happens. If everybody's getting it correct, there's no real difference in the groups to point to. And if everybody's getting it correct, it's really hard to say that this item does or doesn't have any correlation to understanding or the overall performance. So you can really start to ignore some of those secondary statistics if it's a mastery item, you know, 95, 98%. This is also where when I say, rules, a lot of people, it's a very common rule, probably the most common I hear, is that all items have to have at least a 0.2 discrimination index or a 0.2, 0.5 serial or else they're bad. And there's definitely situations where that would be accurate, but it's not the case always. And in this case, it obviously would not be. It's a mastery level item. Everything's pretty much exactly what you would expect it. Now, as we dig deeper, so we go on to the next one here, we start out and kind of walk through them step by step. 66% of the class got this correct. Definitely not a mastery level item. You've got a third of your class missing this, so that's something that should jump out at you. Doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, but let's take a look deeper. If I see a number that's lower like this, and it's not something where, if it's not a mastery level question and it is lower, I'm going to start looking at the secondary stats just to validate that this is lower for a good reason. Not that there's any real concern, just to make sure that this is lower for a good reason. So the next thing I look at is, okay, 82% of my top performing students got it right, 46% of my bottom performing students got it right. That's a great, great gap there. That results in a discrimination index of 0.36, which is a very strong discrimination index. 0.2 is what you would begin to consider statistically significant discrimination. Under 0.2, so a 0.1 or 0.15 is really not statistically significant in most cases. But in this case, 0.36, that's solidly statistically significant. As I roll kind of onto the next stat here, my point by serial is 0.28. So it does indicate positive correlation with doing well on this item, not doing well on the exam as a whole. As the same kind of holds true, 0.2 is sort of that barrier cutoff on point by serial for statistically significant correlation. Doesn't mean it's good or bad necessarily, but that's at least where the statistical significance starts to come in. As I roll through just to kind of check things out here, I see that every single answer choice is getting some use by the students, which is great. At least to some degree, all of my distractors are distracting. It's not super easy for students to just ignore two of them and focus on a couple and choose between those. So I've got really good distractors here more than likely. As I look through, of my 82%, where's the rest of my top students at, the other 18? Like about 12% of them chose D, about 6% of them chose E. As you look down to the lower, they're spread out much more thoroughly and across most of the answer choices here. So this is just a solid discriminating question. It gives you everything you're looking for between a solid gap here, solid correlation. All your item choices are being used, and ultimately you'd be pretty sound in saying, yes, this item discriminates between my best performing students, my lowest performing students. It did what it was looking to do. The 66%, absolutely nothing to worry about. And you're kind of good to go to move on from there. Now, as we get into this next one, this is where I want to start to compare how the same numbers can mean different things. So as we go through here, I see a difficulty of 0.36. That's immediately a big red flag. 36% of the class getting something right is really low. It doesn't necessarily mean there's a problem, but I would say more than likely there's going to be. As I roll on to look at the next two numbers, I see only 52% of my upper students got it correct and 26% of my lower students. Those numbers are both really low. The lower one doesn't so much concern me. That'll happen. They are the lowest performing students. But when almost half of my top students are getting an item wrong, that's kind of my second red flag. Like, okay, low number in total got this correct. Now a low number of the people who were most likely to get it correct got it. Now we need to look deeper. And as we roll across, we look at a discrimination index of 0.25. That while it is statistically significant, it doesn't mean it's good. It doesn't mean that this item doesn't have some sort of issue. And so this is where you look at the point by serial here as well at 0.22. This is very similar to the previous item we looked at, which was I think 0.28. And so nearly identical point by serial, but yet in this case, very, very different results. So I'm going to take a look through the different answer choices here. And what I see is a lot of confusion and a lot of guessing. And as you start to kind of bring this in, this is another great point where you bring in that knowledge. What is this question about? Is this a topic that I noticed in class when I was talking about it? People were really struggling with it, or historically it's been a very difficult concept. It's one of the most advanced concepts in this block. What is this? And because you're going to want to look at it and say, from a statistical perspective, what I would see is the worst performing students were purely guessing. The fact that the 0.25, 0.17, 0.19, 0.27, and 0.12 across the 5 answer choices looks to me like people were just flat out guessing. Now, when I roll that up to the top students, I feel like there's still some guessing there as well. I look at the upper, I see half of them got it right, but a solid quarter of them chose this B, and then another 10% chose A. They're either able to narrow it down, maybe a couple answer choices further before they guess, and maybe they guess with a little bit more accuracy, but there's something going on here. That's one potential, view of the interpretation of these facts. Now, again, you've got to marry that with what you know from being the faculty member and the teacher. The second one to look at is to say, well, if I look at it, there's also a positive discrimination index, albeit small, over here on this item, on B. 24% of my top students chose it. Is there any validity to B? Do I look at this and I look at the material and say, hey, you know what, like in a really rare, weird scenario that wasn't really what I was going for in this question, that, yeah, technically this could be correct, or yes, this is true, but the best option is still this one, but yeah, this one technically could be correct. Maybe this is actually something where you accept two answers. And so then if you start looking at it that way, I look at, let's combine the stats. So I've got 36% here, 18% here. Now we're looking, closer to 50% of the class getting the item right, or over 50%, I should say, getting the item correct. Down here now, I'd have about 76% of my top students versus about 40% of my bottom. That actually adds up to a pretty solid discriminating item. So maybe there's some validity to B. Now you have to know the content to know whether there's validity to B. So there's like I said, a couple different scenarios here. More than likely, depending on the input from the faculty member, this would be something that we either threw out or accept B and D. Those would be the two options that I would push the strongest to the faculty member as they're considering what to do in taking a look at this question. The way I see when I look at these items, the lower the percent correct, really the higher you want that discrimination index to be, and the higher you want that 0.5 serial to be. If you're going to have something that a very small portion is getting correct, you really, really, really need to make sure it's the right group of students getting it correct, which clearly indicates understanding and not guessing or a problem with the item. The same number that, a 0.25 and a 0.22 might be great if 70 or 80% of the class got it correct, but in my estimation, I would say with 0.36 and 36% of the class getting this item correct, you need higher numbers. You would need, I would say, a significantly higher discrimination index and 0.5 serial. So you've got to take all these things into account. You've got to compare that with what's being taught. You've got to compare that with what you thought was going to happen with this item. A lot of factors that go into it. So as we take a look at the next one, 55% of the class get it correct. Again, that's neither here nor there. That could be just a high discrimination, difficult question, or it could be a major issue. So as we roll into the next stats, the first thing that jumps out at me is 25% of my top students got this correct versus 82% of my lower performing students. That's a extreme reverse discrimination, and that's what you're seeing here in the discrimination index, a negative discrimination of 0.57 and a 0.5 serial of negative 0.43. There's two-ish, maybe three scenarios here on what could have happened. Sometimes you'll see these stats when it's a miskey. Sometimes you'll see these stats in a scenario where faculty members contradicted each other. Or sometimes you've got to look at what learning materials were presented and how this was discussed. And I'll walk through a couple scenarios. This is an actual item, or at least the stats of it are, an actual item from my time at Ohio State. So as we rolled through this one, we saw, okay, 83% of the bottom students getting it correct, 55% on the whole. That's a lot of students to pick D if it's really a miskey. And a quarter of my top students, but 75% of my top students are over here on my upper, or on my answer choice C. So something about this isn't quite adding up. And as we looked into it, what ended up being the case in our scenario was a supplemental reading had been assigned. Not required, just an extra 30-page journal article that really did a deep dive into the topic, and not many students actually read that supplemental article. And usually, in the case of non-required things, it's going to be your best or most driven students to do it. And sure enough, that was the case for us. So our students had read this, gotten a deeper understanding, dug in further, and probably got in a little deeper than their level of education could comprehend fully. And so in doing so, they found a sort of, for lack of a better term, 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon way to find a way to make C correct. And in reading this supplemental article, they said, oh, well, in this scenario, if this happens and that side effect happens and they're treated with this, and then 3 months later this happens and whatever else, then technically, yeah, you could do whatever. And they gained that really from that supplemental reading, and it wasn't the core of what was taught, which is why you see most students who just looked at the lecture materials and the podcast recording, ended up on this correct answer. So in this case, is it you do accept both answers, you throw the item out? There's a couple ways you can go about that. If there's true validity to something, I always advocate for taking another answer choice as correct rather than throwing the item out. And that way, people who really still missed it, like those who chose A, B, and E, are kind of getting a free point, so to speak. But that can happen. So as you get into this, it could be also, different than my situation where this item came from. Maybe it was a miskey. Maybe this was just a really, really, really difficult question, and only the kids who got a really great understanding and dug way into this particular topic are going to be able to differentiate C from D. And that's why, even though it's a really low percentage over here, a ton of your top students got it, very few of your bottom students. And you would expect, given the way this was taught and given how hard to differentiate C and D were as you wrote the item, you would actually expect that if somebody's going to miss it, they're going to choose D. So in that case, maybe you just rescore it and you accept C. It's contextual at that point. But there's a lot of warning signs here. Low difficulty, low upper 27%, negative discrimination, negative point by serial. So when you see that number of red flags, there's usually something going on. So as we get into this next one here, we'll walk through the steps and kind of apply to some different situations. This is really more of a borderline one. If you look, 52% of the class got it right, 64% of your top students, 42% of your bottom students. So again, another one of those kind of right on the edge, borderline, maybe mediocre discrimination indexes, just under the statistical significance line for point by serial. And if you look through here, and you look at the breakdown of kind of where students ended up, everybody was able to kind of eliminate E. And then your bottom students are basically eliminating D for the most part as well, and then likely guessing between the other three is the first indication that I would kind of get from these facts. As I look at the top students, they seem to be able to narrow it down a little bit further, and for the most part, they also eliminated B, but then they were maybe guessing between A and C. Or again, this could be a scenario where there's potentially some validity to A. This is where, for me, it's right on the border, and the scoring decision in this case would depend 100% on the context. These are right on the edge of where you'd want them to. You might want them a little bit higher. 52% is not bad. It's certainly not as low as 36%, as we saw in the items earlier. And close to 2/3 of your top students still got it correct. But it's kind of your classic borderline item, and that's where the context really, really needs to come into play. One of the other things you need to take a look at here as well is the opportunity cost. And so as we look at some items, one of the things to think about is where and how things are taught in your curriculum. One of the things that's really common these days is for people to be doing curricular overhaul, so curricular redesign, integrating parts of the curriculum that had never been integrated before. Even if you were mostly integrated, there were still some side pieces, and people are now even putting those into their full integration, or maybe they're moving from a course-based to a fully integrated or concept-based or competency-based curriculum. And across the way of doing that, you can end up with some unintended circumstances. I'll give you an example. We had a section of our curriculum that used to be taught really in like a 3-week chunk that was very focused just on that. Everything else in our curriculum was pretty much integrated, but that was still a 3-week side thing that happened about halfway through their second year. We did a curricular overhaul, transformative things, really redid a lot of stuff, and we decided, no, really, truly everything is going to be integrated. So we took that little 3-week chunk that they were doing on the side during the second year, and we spread it out across the whole of their first 2 years in school. And so it was a little dose of it in every single block. And the other thing that we did in looking at this was saying, hey, as we measure the contact time and what's the most important to have to be covering when we have our students in contact with our faculty versus what can they cover on their own, what can be independent learning. We decided that pretty much all of this material could be done here independent learning. So it was turned into a series of e-modules or, read this 20 or 30 page PDF or whatever else it might be. The unintended consequence that started to show up in our statistics was that we started seeing horrible stats on the questions that were about that topic that we had just integrated. And at first, the stats were so bad we were just throwing them out. But as we started to take a step back and look at the context and read evaluations of the course, discuss things with students and feedback meetings we would have with them, take a look at, on our LMS, how many people were actually downloading those PDFs or watching those e-learning modules, what we found was the 30-page dense article that we were using to cover this topic in a block was going to take them 6 or 8 hours to read it a couple times, synthesize it, take some notes on it, and really like take the time to understand it. But it was only going to be about 3 questions on the exam at most. And so the student's opportunity cost started to look like, well, I can spend 6 to 8 hours on studying this and understanding it in order to get 3 questions correct on the exam, or I can hope that I can wing it, even if I miss all 3 of those questions, or maybe I guess on some of them correctly. I'm going to completely eliminate that. I'm not going to spend a minute on it and hope that the 8 hours of studying I would have done to get those 3 answers right, if I devote it to all the other topics in the block that are tested much more heavily, that I can get a higher score there and more than compensate for the difference. And so sure enough, these horrible statistics we were seeing had nothing to do with the quality of the question, had nothing to do with whether or not the students actually understood it or not. It was an active choice happening pretty much collectively by our student body to blow these things off. And so we had to kind of account for that in the curriculum. We ended up turning them into quizzes that were just based on that material, because otherwise the students were choosing to miss it. And they could also win through this game, because if with the whole class choosing to do it, the stats were so bad that for the first couple exams, we threw the items out and they won. They didn't even lose points for the things they intentionally didn't study. And so that's where we had to get to a point where we ignored the stats on those. We had a really solid faculty review process for items where people would write them. We had a committee of people who would review the items for quality and appropriateness and the style, make sure they were in a board style question, not negatively worded, and all those types of things. So we did a really solid review quality process on the item to make sure it was good, knowing that we were going to have to probably ignore the statistics, because if we threw things out because of the statistics, the students were winning, and they were essentially not being tested over this content during the entirety of our curriculum because we kept throwing it out. So that's another case where you can look at stats and see one thing, but in reality something completely different is happening, and you should maybe keep something that has a reverse discrimination, or you should maybe keep something that has horrible statistics, because it's really student making a choice on their own, study time and what's worth it for them. So as I go through here, this last example is really more of a middle ground between some of the extreme ones I've shown you. We had our mastery level questions. We had some of our really highly discriminating questions where a low percentage of class were getting this correct. But as we walk through this one, 71%, the real solid middle ground, 90% of the top students, 55% of the bottom students, for a very strong 0.34 discrimination index. And I'd say that's even stronger because of the 71. If this was 20, then we'd want this to be higher. But because it's 71, there's only so much of the group that's even missing the item. So to get that high of a discrimination, when 71% of the class is getting it correct, that's very solid. Point by serial shows a strong correlation. And as we walk through the items here, 90%, a couple of people just happen to miss this. And you can look at the bottom students here, and they were a little bit spread out. Really the only feedback here might be, hey, what's the answer choice A? It's consistently over years. I see that nobody's ever using it. Maybe it's really not a good enough distractor, and I need to work on that. And that gets a little bit more into refining your assessments than knowing what they're telling you. But in this case, I'd say a very, very strong discriminating question, almost as good as you can get for a question that still has a huge chunk of the class getting it correct. And so this is a very quality item. Let's talk about some of these stats as far as, what the general guidelines are. And, I've talked about how I'm not a fan of rules. I don't like the, 0.2 or better, or else it has to be thrown out. Because like I said, in mastery situations, that you're going to have a problem. The other thing is negative discrimination or negative point by serial. You can sometimes pop an accidental negative number simply by having a mastery item that 99% of the class got right, and one top student had a brain fart that day, and just, that particular fact slipped their mind. They chose the wrong answer. And so because one of your, top students got it and 100% of the rest of the class got it correct, you actually see a negative number, which means nothing. So, those situations like that really break any hard and fast rules. But I do want to give you a guideline, somewhere to start as far as making sure you're understanding them correctly. The item difficulty and p-value is not an acceptable specific number. It's a correlation. The lower the item difficulty p-value, the higher you want to see your discrimination statistic. So that discrimination index, you want it to be higher. The point by serial needs to be higher. And so it's sort of a sliding scale between the two. The higher the p-value, so 96% of the class get it correct, the lower you need those discriminating statistics to be, so long as you intended for it to be a mastery question, and vice versa. So, you know, it really, you have to marry it against your intent and then marry it against the other statistics. So it's really more of, it's not a, this is a good number, anything above 50% of the class getting correct is good or bad for p-value. That's not really the case. It's really more of a correlation between the two. If it's high, you can see lower on the others. If it's low, you want to see higher on the others. And you're just looking at the ratio and the comparison between those two things. Now, upper 27%, personally, I think that if less than 60% of your top performers are getting a question correct, you need to at least be looking deeper. That's going to trigger a red flag as far as I'm concerned. You really want to make sure that the bulk of your top 27% are getting your discrimination items right, or getting them correct. And, you know, why 60%? Again, I think that's just a good middle ground. You start to get less than that, you're looking at basically half the class of half of your top performers getting something wrong, and that starts to become worrisome to me. Some might say 70%, some might say 50%. That's where it's a little bit of gut feel. But in general, loosely, if I see less than 60, I'm immediately kind of jumping to, okay, red flag, let me look at the deeper stats. I might not do anything, I might not score anything, but that's a red flag for me. And if less of your top students than your bottom students are getting it correct, there's also potentially an issue. Exceptions, like I mentioned before, where it's a mastery and one top student happened to miss it, occur. So again, not hard and fast rule, but in general, if you're seeing less top students than bottom students get an item correct, you're going to want to take a deeper dive. On the lower 27%, really, as low as 0 can be acceptable, and as high as 100% can be acceptable. It's a little bit different in the sense that the upper 27%, I do have a floor to kind of my acceptable nature there. But with the lower 27%, let's say 35, 40% of the class get it right, all the top students get it, none of the bottom students get it. There could be a scenario there where 0 bottom performers get it, and you would still want to keep the item. But again, it's really more about how does this number relate to the upper 27%? How do both of those numbers relate to the item difficulty? But you want to take a look. If it's 0, you're at least going to want to dive deeper. You're going to want to make sure you've got really strong numbers. Now, if we get into discrimination index, this ties to the difficulty. The lower the difficulty, as far as, to be clear, if I'm talking a mastery level item of 100%, 95% of the class getting something correct, then I will accept a lower or even a not statistically significant discrimination index. So something below 0.2, which is not considered statistically significant, as long as it's a mastery level item, I'm going to be okay with that. Now, the lower the percentage of the class getting correct, so 60, 50, 40, 30%, as you move down, I want to see the discrimination index going up. 0.3 or greater is considered highly discriminating, but just because an item is highly discriminating doesn't mean that it's actually acceptable for scoring or that you don't have an issue there, because 30% of your top students getting something correct and 0% of your bottom students is highly discriminating, but it's also a big problem because 70% of your top students miss it. So 0.2 is where statistical significance kicks in. Anything greater than that is going to have a more and more and more solid discrimination value to it, but again, the context is going to matter. And then lastly, point by serial, which the guidelines on these are very similar for discrimination index and point by serial, even though they are calculated differently. Same sort of deal. 0.2 and above is considered to have positive correlation with assessment performance on the whole versus that item. Lower levels are fine for mastery. You can't discriminate on a mastery item if 100% of the class is getting correct. It's just not mathematically possible. But the lower that percent of the class goes, the higher I'd like to see the point by serial. And then you got to marry it with those circumstantial factors, and those things together are going to make up your decision. So in general, 0.2, okay, pretty good. It's significant. 0.3, really good. 0.4, 5, 6, above that is phenomenal. It'd be really rare, I think, actually, if we just see a 0.5, 6, or 7. But again, all has to be done in concert. You can't look at these things in a vacuum. So the last one is not an item statistic, and I threw this at the end for a reason because I didn't want it to get confused in with the others. But if I want to take a second and talk about the KR20, because it is a statistic used for assessment validity and reliability, and it's a scale from 0 to 1. There's some really quirky things with it, though, that can make it be skewed very easily. So ultimately what a KR20 is telling you is, are the results of this reliable, repeatable? Is there something on the whole wrong with the assessment and that's affecting performance? The closer to 1 you get, great, you know, it's a very reliable assessment. You're looking at very little noise statistically that is contributing to the performance on the exam, versus the lower you get, you know, the less reliable that assessment is, and maybe there are some issues in there. Now, it's heavily, heavily influenced by a couple of factors. One is the number of students who take the exam. The other is the number of questions in the exam. And so if you have a low number, I would almost completely and totally disregard that. In fact, one of the things that happens kind of frequently around here is we will have faculty call in and talk to their account manager and say, you know, no matter what I do, I'm getting horrible KR20s and I don't understand what's going on. And I'll hop on the phone with them and walk them through it. And it turns out they're giving a 10-question quiz to 25 people. You're never going to get a very good KR20 out of that. It's just way too small for the way this metric works. So I would advise, you know, using it as a first glance, you know, an initial red flag, great. That's fine, especially if you have a large number of items, 100, 150, 200 items, and a large number of students. You know, getting 100, 150, 200, even 400 or 500 students. You see this statistic used the most frequently, usually by licensing bodies or agents that give very large-scale exams. It is on the top of all of our item analysis reports and our performance reports inside of our system, which is partially where some people will say, hey, I'm seeing this number and I'm worried about it. Don't worry about it. Take those things into consideration. I didn't use this very much, to be completely honest with you. And the reason I didn't use it very much was I didn't care how great the KR20 came out or how great the average of the exam was. I was still going to look at every single question statistics. I was going to at least scan through and look for red flags on all of them. So since it wasn't really going to affect my decision one way or another on whether I looked at items or whether I would choose to rescore those items based on their stats, it became something that I would kind of glance at just you know, as an aside while I did the real analysis. This can be, you know, sometimes I will hear people use this, hey, if I've got a great KR20, I pretty much leave my stats alone. If I have a poor one, then I dig into the psychometrics. My personal preference would be to dig in regardless. And if you kind of start to get into a system and a rhythm of, you know what the red flags are to look for, you speed that process up so it doesn't have to be so time consuming. You just kind of scan through, look for those red flags. But I did want to touch on this just for a moment because it does bring a lot of confusion, and it usually brings a lot of unnecessary angst of people being concerned that the stat is coming out terrible and really it's completely not within their control. So a few of the other factors that I think I talked about in the stories I told throughout the way, again, the stats don't tell the whole story. You've got to look at student behavior. Are they cheating? Are they actively choosing not to study something because of the return on investment? Was there conflicting content between a couple faculty? Maybe, you know, you taught something very, very clearly, but somebody else's topic sort of bleeds in on the edge to the things you were talking about, and either off the cuff or in general, they have a slightly different view on something than you, and especially in health sciences. All health sciences, there's a lot of gray area, so there's room for conflicting opinions. Maybe a different faculty member said something that is causing the students to be confused on your item, and then they're testing like, well, did Dr. Smith write this item? Because if so, then I bet it's B. But if Dr. Jones writes this item, I think it's probably D. And you really want to get your students away from having to guess who the author is in order to get the question right. So was there some conflicting content? Faculty, was it that supplemental reading that maybe took them a little too deep and led them into some really rare instances where a different answer could be correct, and that's not really what you were going for, but they discovered it through that, those sort of things. The 6 degrees from Sunday thing, where they start to over-dissect and over-analyze, and well, if this happens and that happens and so on, then technically A, B, or C, you know, might be correct instead of D or something along those lines. And that's a decision when you look at those scoring, what are the stats saying, and also how did you word the question? Was it, what's the best course of treatment, or what is the course of treatment? Just that little nuance of having best in there or not. Best, you could say, hey, look, yeah, you're right, A is technically correct, but it's not the best course of treatment, it's the course of treatment for the rarest thing. So no, we're not rescoring this, D is the correct answer. But if you just say, what are the course of treatment? Well, then, and they're both technically course of treatment, it gets very nuanced and there's one thing I know about students in higher education, especially the health sciences, they will fight you tooth and nail on these things at times if you let them. So it can be an interesting process. A few other things that I really recommend, an item review process. It takes a lot of the guesswork and a lot of the statistical anomaly out of your exam if you've got well-reviewed items. Look at them for format. Make sure that they're not negatively worded, that they're not intentionally just confusing, that it's not simply something that because they read it quickly, you're going to get the wrong answer. You want well-worded, well-formatted items that usually match your licensure exam. this is the level of difficulty. One of the things with having guest lecturers or having experts in the field come in and teach parts of blocks is sometimes they could be talking to a first-year nursing student and they're really getting into nurse practitioner level stuff, or a first-year medical student and they're talking about fellowship level stuff. You want to make sure that the difficulty is appropriate for your group of students, and by having a review process, you can try to ensure that. And if you keep the difficulties appropriate for your student stage, you're going to see less statistical things come up during your analysis. And then alternative correct options. We went to a rule at one point where every single question had to have 5 answer choices because the board all had 5 answer choices. And so some of our faculty who used to use a lot of 4 and didn't want to put a lot of thought into it would put in answers like the Beatles for E, or the sun, or Milky Way bars. I got some of the most random things you would ever see because we said, hey, you have to put in the 5th option, and they just threw something down. And so then you all of a sudden start seeing, why are there all these options not being ever used no matter what? And you look at them and you're like, oh, it's because it's Milky Way bar, you know? So a good review process. It doesn't always have to necessarily be content experts. The difficulty one, you might need somebody who's at least familiar. But as far as format and making sure that they, you know, are following best practice for item writing, that can just be any faculty, and a kind of peer review process is really helpful. The historical item analysis. So something also to step back and look at when you take a look at these statistics are historical performance. And so if you look at how this item is performed, if you use it for a long time, for years, and it's always come out the same way, that can help point you to certain solutions so that you know, hey, when I have given this for 5 years, it always performed great. This year we switched from an in-class lecture to an e-learning module, and it went terribly. You know that it's the learning method change, not that, you know, there's something wrong with the item itself. Versus if you're using all new items all the time, it's harder to begin to differentiate between, did a learning change, did a delivery change, did somebody contradict something, or is there a flaw in the way the item is written itself? So the more historical data you can build up, the better, and the more variables you're going to be able to eliminate, and the better comparisons you're going to be able to make. Cheating especially. Something consistently for 5 years, 60% of the class highly discriminating gets this correct, and then all of a sudden 100%, I would guess that item's out there somewhere. So I strongly advise to reuse and recycle. Where do we fit into all this? So if you're a client of ours, we've got a lot of resources. We have a lot of different reports and things that you can generate quickly and use. We have built-in tools for scoring that can help you with instantly rescoring the exam when you do make a scoring decision. If you're not a client of ours, we can really help provide you with the data that you might be missing in a digestible form, provide you with tools to make that actionable, because having these stats and knowing you want to do something doesn't really help you if, to accept B, you've got to review 200 pieces of paper and see who put B and give them each a point by hand. That's not really a great use of your time. We have tools so that you can go in and say, hey, I'm going to accept E and B, hit rescore, 30 seconds, you're done. So we will track that historical data for you. Every time an item's used, every time you revise that item, we'll show you the difference in stats between revision 1, revision 2, revision 3. So we have all of those things sort of built in, and we can provide a lot of the tools that you need so you can kind of focus on what you should be focusing on instead of trying to figure these things out. I will say thank you guys again for attending. We're going to do questions in just a second. So if you haven't put your questions in the question bar, please feel free to go ahead and do so right now. And I'll answer as many of those as we possibly can. While we're doing that, I just want to note we do have other webinars and podcasts and things available for you. So if you missed something, you can always go find it on our resources page. And you can search for other videos, white papers, etc. So please check out the other things we have available. We really do. We're a company where most of us in some way, shape, or form are former educators, and so we really like that tie back to the education community, and we try to provide things that are going to be helpful to our colleagues who are still on the other side of things. So thank you again. Again, apologies for Tuesday, and we'll kind of jump in with questions from there.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Eric. We do already have a bunch of questions, so let's go ahead and jump in. And bear with me because a lot of these are broken up into follow-up questions as well, so they might be a little bit disjointed, but I'm going to do my best. So the first question is, does a point by serial of 0.22 equal 22% of students that got this item correct also did well, excuse me?
No, and that's a good That's a good question because the discrimination index does actually equal a percentage if you dig into the math. So no, on the point by serial, it does not equal 22% of the class. Essentially, and the math on that one is really complex, and so I would hesitate to send you too far down a rabbit hole in trying to dive into that. But essentially, when you see a point by serial of 0.22, you've hit the statistical cutoff as far as, yes, there is significant correlation, but it's not, it's not related at that point to any specific number of students. So kind of disassociate the percentages and the numbers of students and whatnot. It's really more of a scale at that point. Above 0.2 is going to be statistically significant. The higher it gets, the stronger that correlation is. But it's not an exact, I guess if you really dug into the math, you could probably figure out exactly how many numbers of students it's telling you. But in general, it's more, you're looking for the scale to tell you whether there's just correlation or no correlation, and to a degree how strong that correlation is. What I will say is some of the absolute best point by serials I've ever seen on some of the most phenomenally written discriminating questions I've ever seen are still only popping out at 0.35 or 0.4, 0.5 even on the point by serial scale. And if you look at the number of students who got that question correct, and if you look at the average of the exam, you would not say that only half the students or only 40% of the students did that. So no, kind of divorce that from the percentages and the number of students there, and just kind of look at it as a correlation scale.
Okay, next question. What is your opinion on scoring when a question is thrown out? Should students who get the item wrong get credit for it, or should the 50-item exam become a 49-item exam and rescored for all students?
I think it depends. What I would say is I can see the argument in certain scenarios where, especially if it's just too difficult an item, that the content was taught, that the item was really more of a, expert level student who's already done with their degree and out in the workforce for years sort of level difficulty versus a first-year student sort of difficulty. I could see an argument for saying, hey, we're going to do this item so that the people who got it right aren't penalized. What I would say is, though, if it's not that scenario, and even in those scenarios I tend to lean towards throwing out, I'm not, in my world, at least we were in medical school, I felt like bonus points should have ended at high school. That's just kind of a personal pet peeve and philosophy of mine, so again, take that for what it's worth. But on the other end of that spectrum of a bad item where we look at it and it's like, oh, this item's poorly written or it wasn't understood, we don't want to reward for guessing, and people shouldn't get an advantage over other people, because if it truly is an item that you're saying this is a bad item and this item needs to be thrown out, then you are in a way, especially in competitive programs, disadvantaging people who it was a bad item and that's why they missed it. It wasn't an accurate measure of learning. If it's an accurate measure of learning, I think you have a little bit more leeway on which way you want to go there. But if you can look at the item and the stats and say, you know what, no, this is not an accurate measure of their learning or a valid measure of their learning, then regardless of if 40% got it correct, I would still throw it out. And that was the process we followed. We would still throw those out, and the people who, it would become out of 49 instead of 50. What I would say, and this is where we hedged our bets a little bit in all fairness, our cutoff for passing was 70%. So if somebody had a 70% before we threw that item out, and we just determined that item was way too hard, inappropriate difficulty level, and we threw it out and it caused them to drop to 69.7, and therefore they would have failed the exam, we would go ahead and bump that individual student back up and allow them to pass. Whether that's controversial or not, I'll let you decide. I sometimes was okay with it. I sometimes wasn't a fan of that practice, but it was one that our program just decided to do. But in general, we always threw out if it wasn't an accurate and valid measure of learning, regardless of the impact. And then if there was, some specific consequence, we would take a look at that individual instance.
Okay, next question is, I was curious about how you were able to find out what was happening in some of the scenarios you mentioned, such as the one in which you found out students were choosing not to study particular materials. How did you find that out?
It was really a series of a few things. One, the lectures on that were really, really, really poorly attended, which doesn't always mean anything. If you're a podcast school, you'll know that a lot of students never attend and they just podcast and double the speed of the podcast and they can watch it in half the time. But very poorly attended. Then we started looking and seeing, hey, why is the downloads and views on the podcast for this? If there was only 10 out of our 250 students there, why are there only 20 downloads of the podcast? So in total, 30 people were exposed to this content. We also started seeing complaints as the course evaluations in the block and the faculty evaluations came in. We would see complaints that, hey, 30 pages of reading for a topic like this is overkill, and a New England Journal of Medicine article written by experts in the field on something that we're just barely being exposed to is, way too time consuming, and it's not worth our time. So it was really a variety of places. We also, in some cases, like our e-learning modules, we could track the number of people who clicked, opened, finished them, and things like that. So we use a little bit of statistics from our LMS system to see that, hey, why aren't people doing this? And that wasn't done as part of the assessment process. That was actually just done more as part of the evaluating every block and course and curriculum and making sure they were good. We always looked at those things as part of that. And then we started to be able to tie the two together, which is why it took us a little while. So for a while, the students got away with it. We were throwing all the questions out that they were just choosing out to study for. And then eventually halfway through, we figured it out and we stopped doing it.
Okay, next question. Can you use KR20 for accumulated scores over time from multiple administrations?
It depends. The scenario in which I've even remotely delved into that is where we did compare year over year sometimes KR20 of exams, especially if they were very close to the same, to make sure we were seeing similar numbers. And that especially when we did curricular reform, if we kept an exam the same but we reformed the curriculum a lot, that would be a time when we would sometimes look at that KR20 because we knew that the assessment had stayed the same, so we had that constant variable. And if all of a sudden the KR20 of that assessment changed, then we knew it was our curricular change. But KR20, like I said, it's not one I use a whole lot, so I don't want to necessarily pass myself off as too much of an expert on that one. So unfortunately, I got to give you a half answer, but I'd hate to give you a wrong answer. So, for that one, really, it was just kind of a glance stat for us, and I want to make sure people understood how easily it could be skewed. But I don't have a great answer for you, unfortunately.
The next question is, so if I'm testing small groups, say 7 to 14 students at a time, does this mean I won't have truly valid statistical data ever?
For a KR20, sure. With the items, you will, but you've got to build up the history. When you're talking 7 to 14 students, it's really, really hard to say that there's any sort of real meaning between your top 27% and your bottom 27%. It's just way too small of a number. Now, if you're an ExamSoft client or considering becoming one of the things that our software does is every single time you use that item, we're accumulating historical statistics, and we break it down for you in two ways. One is a combination. So let's say you've now given this 10 times over the course of several courses or years or whatever else, and you had 14 people the entire time, you'll be able to see the stats of that item of all those added up. So now you're talking closer to 140 students taking the exam. What's the average difficulty? What's the average discrimination? What's the average point by serial and things like that? So you can you will eventually get to some numbers that are worthwhile and that are usable. On an individual quiz by quiz basis, though, with just the 10 to 14 students, it's going to be really hard. And really, I would say most of those stats at that point aren't going to be valid at all. I would probably look at the percent correct, and that's about it. Any substat from there is going to have too small of a sample. Even the percent correct is almost too small of a sample. Once you get to that, say, 100, 140, 200, or however as many as you can get mark on the historical, then your exam by exam or quiz by quiz ones start to become a little bit more significant because you can compare it to the history. And you can say, okay, historically, with 150 people taking this, 60% of the class gets it correct with a discrimination index of 0.3, and I'm not seeing it come out that way. But yeah, unfortunately with stats, always the case is more is better, more is more valid, and you're going to really struggle with the validity of any statistical analysis you do on numbers that low.
Okay, kind of a follow-up to that question, Eric, is this question. Does using a lot of matching questions affect KR20? For example, a matching question with 6 answers is looked at by ExamSoft as one test item.
Yes, it's going to affect the KR20. Matching items in particular, are one of those things that if you talk to the extreme assessment snobs of the world, they frown upon them pretty hard. But some of our licensure bodies out there still actually use them. So it's kind of a mixed bag. But part of the reason is, yes, the stats definitely get murkier when you're using matching questions. And so there's an argument based on that, one, you're making your overall data a little bit more murky. The stats on those aren't necessarily the most valid. As you get down, a matching question with 6 options, if you really know 3 of them and you don't know the other 3, are you getting the other 3 correct basically just by process of elimination and guessing and association of them, or is it really an accurate measure of what the student truly knows? And so there's an argument there as well. So yeah, you're going to make your analysis a little bit harder if you're using a lot of matching questions. Even if each point within that is looked at almost like a unique question, it's still going to impact the statistics. So there's nothing I could, other than saying either don't use them. I don't really know what you can do to mitigate that, unfortunately.
Okay, that is all the questions that we have at this time. If you have additional questions, you can always send those to info@examsoft.com. Again, I'd like to thank everybody for being here, especially for those of you who attempted to join with us on Tuesday and we had to reschedule. We appreciate you taking the time to come back on a Friday. So again, thank you. Thank you so much for coming back. Again, this webinar has been recorded today, so you should be receiving a link to the recording as well as a copy of the slide deck in the next 24 to 48 business hours. That will be emailed to you automatically. As you close out of this webinar, you will get a quick pop-up box with 5 survey questions on it. We would really appreciate everybody taking the time to fill those out so that we can continue to provide relevant content, as well as if you'd like to give Eric any feedback, because this will be a session at our ExamSoft Assessment Conference coming up next month in Dallas. And on that note, we are getting down to the wire. I believe it's 31 days left until EAC. There's still time to join us. There are still tickets and hotel rooms available, but you need to get those done really quickly because I know the hotel block ends on Monday. So that's assessmentconference.com. We are still taking registrants. Again, thank you so much for your time today. I hope everybody has a great weekend. Thanks so much.